All right, I graded your homework number 6 over the weekend, and hopefully you've received yours back. If you haven't, let me know, and I will send it to you again. This was a 15-point homework assignment, so people either got 5, 10, or 15 points, depending on how perfect their answers were. Okay, there were at least 2 groups who turned in really nice answers that were absolutely correct, except you failed to explain them in sufficient detail, so you would have lost a lot of points if that was a final exam question. So I didn't give you full credit so that you will hopefully learn your lesson for the final. All right. Now, oh, Sable, nice background, buddy. It's like you're outside somewhere.
Right? Gotta enjoy.
Yeah, I think I've been there before.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And Hannah's got an awesome background too. I didn't realize that you were actually a superhero, Hannah. All right. You'll be shocked to discover that I have not gotten chapter analyses for everyone yet on chapter 15. This is really complicated stuff. Please read the chapter. Send me your chapter analysis, okay? It's gonna be confusing if enough as it is. You might as well try to get it from at least 2 different sources. One from Professor Mankiw and the other from Professor Greenlaw. Okay, so what we're going to do today is start to derive the dynamic aggregate demand curve in much the same way that we did the dynamic aggregate supply curve. The difference is that there are a bunch of elements in the DAD curve that we have not talked much about, if at all, this semester. All right, so let's dive in with looking at the PowerPoint. All right. There it is. All right. The way that I keep track of what the heck is going on is I start with the equations of the model, which are in the book in table 15.1. 15.1, or the table rather, is 1 whole page long. I have a nice picture of it here. No, that's the ugly picture. Let me find the nice picture. I had a nice picture of it here. All right, here we go. Where did it go?
So much fun.
Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. So let me jump out of the PowerPoint for a second. See if that will magically, nope, didn't magically do it. Let's try again. No, that's not it either. Sorry, guys, I apologize. Okay, right, my bad. Isn't that bizarre? You guys, of course, don't know what I'm talking about, but trust me, it's bizarre. All right. So Let's try again. That goes away, and that one is here. Gosh, this is so bizarre. All right. Oh, okay, now I know what's going on. Yes, I am definitely messing this up. So finally. Okay, here we go. Share screen. Here it is. Okay, table 15.1. It's a whole page long, but really what the meat of the model is right here in the equations. These are just definitions, everything else down there. All right. Now, going from there back to the PowerPoint. Okay, I know this is probably confusing, but on my slides, I use Q's instead of Y's for GDP. That's just the way I am. So QP is potential real GDP. Q sub T is GDP, actual GDP in the period T, which is the current period. Okay, so these are the equations that apply to the dynamic aggregate demand model. And we're going to work our way through each of these equations. There's a lot here. I recognize that it's complicated. So let's take our time at this. Okay, so let's start with the aggregate demand equation. Okay, let's think about what this says. What this says is actual GDP, that's Q sub T, is potential GDP minus alpha times the difference between RT and rho. Alpha is just a parameter, it's a fraction between 0 and 1. Okay, R is the real interest rate in period T, and rho is the natural interest rate. Let's talk about what those things mean here. Somebody asked a question in their chapter analysis and said, is the natural rate of GDP the same as what I call potential real GDP? And the answer is absolutely yes. Okay, so that gives us a clue about rho. Rho is defined as, well, no, let's take this a step at a time. Rho, does anybody remember what how rho is defined in the model?
Rho is the one that looks like the letter P, right?
Yes, it is a Greek R.
It's the natural rate of interest.
Yes. Okay. Then what is the natural rate of interest then? What does that mean?
In the equation?
No, I mean in general.
Oh. The rate that, the interest rate that it should be at?
Sort of, okay. We know that interest rates vary depending on the state of the economy, right? We've already talked about how interest rates rise as the economy is booming, and they fall when the economy is slowing down. right? Everybody remember that? Okay, so rho is the real interest rate that would occur if the economy were at full employment and potential real GDP. So if the economy is perfectly right, rho is the interest rate that would occur. I know it's a little hard to get your head around this, so that's okay. Now let's think about what this means. While we haven't really emphasized this before, according to economic theory, real economic activity like consumption and investment expenditure depend on real interest rates, not on nominal interest rates. So we have to ask the question, what's the difference between a real interest rate and a nominal interest rate? What would you say?
Well, nominal would be like based off of the year before it. How much has it changed? Or like is real like based on inflation?
Yes, but let's start more simply. What is an interest rate? Just a plain old interest rate. Hey, Mar. You made it.
Hello.
What's an interest rate?
It's like the amount you have to pay in order to receive like money or resources.
It is the price of borrowed money. So looking at it from the other side, from the lender side, how would we define a real interest rate?
The revenue you make by letting people borrow money.
Yeah, it's the reward for lending. When you lend money, there are several issues involved. The most important one is that when you lend money to somebody else, you no longer have the use of that money, at least while before they pay you back. So to compensate you, you deserve a return, a reward. So fundamentally, that's what a real interest rate is. Whoopsie, didn't mean to, oh, sorry, I'm not sorry. Okay, fundamentally, that's what a real interest rate is. It's the reward for lending. Now, there are other issues as well. One is the longer the loan, the longer you go without your funds. And so oftentimes, lenders will add on to the basic interest rate a premium to compensate them for the longer time it takes for them to get their money back. That's sort of an illiquidity premium. Furthermore, we know that, that not all borrowers are equally creditworthy, right? So if you are a risky borrower, the lender will often tack on what's called a risk premium on the loan. You pay a higher interest rate to compensate you, compensate the lender for the chance that you might not be able to pay back the loan. Okay, so the liquidity premium is related to something I've mentioned before, which is the term structure of interest rates. Typically, longer term loans require higher interest rates. And so the normal term structure is an upward sloping line showing the longer the maturity, the higher the interest rate paid on that loan. Okay. The risk premium is something similar, but has to do with the perceived riskiness of the borrower. Okay. The safest loans at the moment appear to be loans to the federal government, Treasury interest rates. Okay. The 10-year Treasury interest rate last week, so lending money to the US government for 10 years, the 10-year Treasury interest rate was less than 1%. It was a fraction of a percent, which is really, really low when you think about it. Okay. Anybody besides the Treasury has to pay higher interest rates in order to get loans, in order to get borrowed money. So the very best corporations would pay a higher interest rate than the Treasury rates on the same maturity of a loan. So the 10-year corporate bond rate for Exxon, say, or for Google, say, okay, or for Apple Computer, say, or Microsoft, is going to be a little higher than the 10-year bond rate on Treasury securities. Okay. When you get further out in the risk area, the interest rates tend to go up pretty dramatically. If you're familiar with bond rating agencies like Moody's, they actually put a grade on loans. Okay, the highest grade for corporate securities is AAA, AAA. That means the lowest risk category. Okay, they do this for loans to the state of Virginia as well, and loans to Mary Washington as well. Our loans rate really highly because we have a very good repayment record, which is a good thing. But when you get into sketchy companies, the interest rates go much higher, and you get into the BBB grade of loans, which are riskier. Anything worse than that is called not investment grade. Think of it as a D. Okay. So what I'm talking about here is very much real world stuff that you would learn about if you took money in banking. Has anybody had money in banking? I'm just curious. Anybody?
I had.
Sable? Oh, okay. So did you learn about term structure and risk premiums and things like that?
We learned about risk premiums, but
Okay.
yeah,
Cool.
that's
Anybody else want to admit it?
I'm taking
No,
it
you've
next semester.
Okay. Good. Who's that? Who's that?
Hannah.
Oh, okay, Hannah. So you can come back and report.
Yep.
Actually, I heard a rumor that Hannah's going to take my Econ 405 class next semester, and so she can do the report in that class. You guys are all eligible, just saying. It's going to be an awesome class. That's the one where we're going to analyze the current recession. Okay, so in the context of this DAD-DAS model, there's only one interest rate. It's the interest rate, okay? And there are two versions of that interest rate. There is the nominal version and there is the real version, okay? The real interest rate is the nominal rate adjusted for inflation. This idea is reflected in what we call the Fisher equation. Here is the Fisher equation. So the idea is you make a loan, you're a lender, you charge little I sub t. When you get repaid, what your money is actually worth is I sub t minus the inflation that existed over the life of the loan. Okay, so your real return, your real interest rate may be less than or even greater than what the nominal interest rate was, depending on how accurately you anticipated inflation being. Okay, this equation here is ex ante, meaning before the fact. So when you're deciding what to charge, you don't know what the future involves, so you have to make your best guess of what the inflation rate is going to be. That's pi superscript e. Okay, or to put it slightly differently, that's not it. Where did that go? I thought I had that equation in there. Okay, so the idea here is if you're a lender and you're trying to decide what interest rate you want to charge, I'm going to change this slide in real time. Well, that didn't work very well. Interesting. Okay. All right. You're trying to decide what nominal interest rate to charge. So you start by saying, what real rate of return do I want to earn? That's R sub t. And what do I expect inflation to be over the course of the loan? That's pi superscript e. Add those two things together, and that's the interest rate I'm going to charge. And then if I do my forecast correctly, what I will end up with is exactly what I wanted in terms of a real rate of return. What happens if you underestimate inflation? What happens to your real return?
It's
Jack?
gonna be lower than what you expected.
Goes
I'm
down.
sorry?
Your rate of return goes down.
Yeah, your rate of return will be lower than you expected. Okay, and that's not a good thing. During the 1970s, there was a huge transfer of wealth to the middle class. Okay, and the reason why is because the principal way that middle class Americans save is by buying a home. And so they got a mortgage on their home, 30-year mortgage, and lenders consistently underestimated what inflation was going to be over the life of the loan. Because at the beginning of the 1970s, inflation was really modest. It wasn't a big deal at all. And so lenders typically said, here's what I want to earn, so that's what I'm going to charge, without really accounting for inflation. Then what happened over the course of the 70s is inflation accelerated for the reasons that we talked about last week. And so lenders were always behind in their predictions. And so what that meant was, in many cases, real interest rates were actually negative. So homeowners made a killing at the expense of banks and other mortgage lenders, you know, which is not a terrible thing, if you ask me. It's just a thing. Okay. Any questions about that? So basically, to summarize, what we're saying is economic decisions are made based on the real interest rate. The real interest rate is the nominal rate with the effects of inflation subtracted off of that. Before the fact, you use your best guess of what inflation is going to be. That's pi e t plus 1. In this case, after the fact, looking back, you would use the actual inflation that occurred. So Hannah, you're ahead of the game already. before you even walk in the door of money and banking. Because, you know, macro is the gift that keeps on giving. You get more for your money. What? I don't even get a single smile from that? Come on, Aspen, where are you? Yeah, I'm sure Harry is smiling. We just can't see it. Okay.
I am smiling.
All right. Any questions before we move on? Okay, good. So let's go back to the aggregate demand equation. Think about what this equation says. What it says is that there are two things that would cause actual GDP to diverge from potential. There are two things that would cause actual GDP to diverge from the natural rate is the way that Mankiw says it. Okay, so what are the two things? I'll give you a clue. This is one of them, and this is the other one. So let's do this one first. Okay, remember, what is rho? Mar, were you here when we were defining rho?
Natural interest rate.
Yeah, and what does that mean?
I'm not sure.
What we said is it's the real interest rate that would exist if the economy were at potential GDP. Okay, so what this says is GDP will diverge from potential if the real interest rate diverges from the natural interest rate. Okay, this would occur anytime demand or supply of loanable funds changes in financial markets. So anytime, for example, the Fed conducts monetary policy, that's going to be changing the supply of loanable funds. It's going to be changing credit conditions, which means the real interest rate is going to change, and it's going to be different from the natural rate. So the idea here is monetary policy changes cause GDP to diverge from the natural rate. And that's the whole point of this expression right here. Okay, let me give you some examples. Okay, so bear with me here, Mars, so that you can follow this. Let's suppose the Fed conducts an expansionary monetary policy, right? If they do that, do interest rates go up or down? Looks like Jack is excited to answer. Boy, he's just jiving to the music.
Down?
Yeah, interest rates would go down, right? The Fed is trying to stimulate the economy. So they inject a lot of credit into the economy, the money supply goes up, and the real interest rate goes down. When the real interest rate goes down, what happens to investment and consumer spending? Charlotte, are you alive?
What was the second question?
When the real interest rate goes down, what happens to investment and consumer spending, Charlotte?
It would go up.
It would go up. And when investment and consumer spending go up, Lily, what happens to GDP?
It'll go up.
Yeah, exactly. So when the real interest rate goes down, GDP goes up. GDP would be above potential. The economy would be screaming hot, just like it was a few months ago. Okay, does everybody see that? So this term here shows the effects of monetary policy on the demand side of the economy, on GDP and the demand side of the economy. Remember, this is not a behavioral equation exactly. It's really an equilibrium condition. Okay, any questions? Do you guys know how to raise your hand? This is only sort of a joke.
Wait, how do you do it on Zoom? I heard that you can. I don't know how
Yeah,
to.
absolutely. What you do is at the bottom of your screen, there should be, if it's turned on right. Okay, let me jump out of the slide for a minute. Okay. More, the more button. No.
Is it the reactions?
Reactions? No. Oh, there, look, see? Quinn raised his hand. Manage participants. Quinn, how did you do that? Oh.
If you go to participants,
Yeah,
in the bottom right, it says raise or lower hand.
Gotcha. So feel free to ask questions that way, guys. You are welcome to put questions in the chat, but the problem is I only have 2 eyes and I may not see them, but if you raise your hand, that pops up on my screen and so I can't miss it, he says confidently. All right. Now let's go back to the slide. All right. Now, the second part of the story here is GDP diverges from potential when epsilon changes. Epsilon represents demand shocks. Or I should say, since this here is the effects of monetary policy, which is a demand shock, epsilon is any other kind of demand shock, anything that shifts aggregate demand besides monetary policy. Okay? So, for example, a positive demand shock adds to potential output, actual GDP goes up. Whereas monetary policy, an expansionary monetary policy, it has a minus sign here, so it actually pulls it. No, it's got to be a minus. Okay, correct. So expansionary monetary policy would reduce R with a minus sign in front of it, means that Q goes up. Okay, so the math is correct there. Okay, now this here is the heart of the model, this equation. Okay, there's one other critical part that we will get to, but this is the aggregate demand, the dynamic aggregate demand curve framework. All comes from this equation. So here's something that you should be aware of. This may not feel intuitive yet, but this is really a very simple model. Okay. Like, for example, Chester. Chester. Where does fiscal policy come into this equation?
Could it come in as part of the other demand shocks?
Yes, it comes in through the epsilon term. Where does a change in autonomous consumption or autonomous investment come in, Rob?
the same place in the
That would be the
epsilon,
same
right?
place. In fact, everything except monetary policy comes in through the epsilon. It's almost as if the authors of this model are minimizing all those other things to focus on monetary policy. And they are. Okay. For example, suppose there's a demand shock. How do you tell in this model where it comes from, whether it is an increase in government spending or an increase in investment expenditure? How do you tell the difference in this model?
You can't?
You can't tell the difference. Like I said, it's a very simple model. Okay. Now I know you're laughing inside saying, yeah, right. Okay. And that's okay. I felt the same way when I was first exposed to this. All right. Well, let me just say one other thing. This model is simple, but it has the flavor of the types of models used by the Fed and other policymakers today. The term of art is DSGE models. Let me just write this in here, not because you're going to remember it, DSGE. Okay. State-of-the-art macro models are called DSGE models. The D stands for dynamic. The S stands for stochastic. The GE stands for general equilibrium. These are models that are theoretically really elegant. They're based on micro foundations. So there are no aggregate consumption functions or aggregate investment functions. Rather, the models are based on the idea explicitly and based on the equations that say aggregate consumption is the result of all consumers in the model maximizing their utility. And investment expenditure is the result of all businesses maximizing their profits. Okay, so they're elegant, they're pretty because they feel right, right? I mean, that's what we argue is the way economic agents operate to optimize whatever their objective function is. Okay, general equilibrium, we touched on that a little bit earlier. It means these are models where every market simultaneously reaches equilibrium. Okay. These models are actually impossible to solve analytically. For those of you who have sufficient math background, it means, it means you can't use algebra or even calculus to find the equilibrium. Okay, the only way you use these models is by turning them into massive forecasting things. They're simulation models. You use the forecasting software to make it find the answer. Because these things tend to be nonlinear, it's mathematically very complicated to do. Okay, so really elegant theoretically. The problem is, what's the problem? Is there a problem? Yes, there is. These are the models that failed to either predict or explain the Great Recession and the global financial crisis. So as elegant as they are, they didn't work just when we needed them to. Okay, but in any case, the DAD-DAS model is a somewhat simplified, slimmed down version of these models. ManQ actually does simulate this set of equations. There is a table, I don't have the book in front of me, later after table 15.1, where he says if you assume these values for the parameters, you can throw this into a computer model and you can run it, and here's what the results look like. So when you get to that table, you might just take a look at it. All right. Any questions before we go on? All right. Now, on a scale of 1 to 5, how comfortable do you feel that you understand what we've presented so far today? Why don't you jump into the chat and just give me a number from 1 to 5? And I don't care, I'm not going to look at who you are. I just want to get a sense of how we're doing. Oh, Jack, you gotta be anal, don't you? Anybody else? Okay, my question for you then is, if I only gave you a choice of 1 through 4, would all of you people who chose 3, would you have picked 2 or would you have picked 3? That's only sort of a joke. Rob says he would have picked a 3. Good job, Rob. Matthew, 2.5. Dude, you're breaking the rules. All right. Okay, that's fine. So here's what we're going to do. Okay. What we're going to do, first I'm going to make that, come on now. I'm going to make that go away. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to stop in a minute and let you guys breathe. This is the easy part of the story, unfortunately. Okay. So beginning next class, we're going to finish this part of the story, which involves looking at the monetary policy rule equation. Okay. And then we're going to decompose it much the way we've done the previous equations today. Okay. Once we get this done, we'll be in a position where we can actually build the dynamic aggregate demand curve. And that's a whole bunch of nasty algebra. But when we get done, it'll make sense to you. Okay. Anybody have questions before we call it a day?
I had a question.
Sure.
So, we talked about how the Fed uses the federal funds rate to set as one of their tools for interest rates.
Yes.
So, where do they get the federal funds rate from if that's done by the banks?
Okay. They don't get it from anywhere. What they do is they conduct open market operations and then they observe the federal funds rate to see what happened. Okay. So if they're putting reserves into the banking system through expansionary monetary policy, those reserves are going to end up in banks, and banks are going to end up lowering the federal funds rate. So they have an idea about how many new reserves are required to reduce the rate by a certain amount. So they give it a shot. And if they get it slightly wrong, then they do a little more or they do a little less until they get it right.
Okay, so it's not like the federal funds rate isn't one specific number that just goes up and down?
Well, it is. It is. It's the average interest rate charged by banks to other banks for overnight loans. So every bank has a federal funds rate, but they track each other pretty closely. Otherwise, arbitrage would occur banks that were offering a lower interest rate would get all the money in a hurry, see, and then they would put the rate back up again.
When are we
Good question.
gonna go over assignment 6?
Oh, I totally forgot about that. We will do that first thing on Wednesday. Thank you, Sid. This is what I have to look forward to, guys.
That looks great.
It is. Came from a farmer's market. Anybody, any other questions?
Did you recently buy that
It was a gift
under
from a friend.
quarantine?
It was a
Oh,
gift
okay.
from a friend.
Did you leave the house? Is
Yeah.
that allowed?
Not for me. Actually, a container of the strawberries showed up on our front porch, and it turned out to be a friend who dropped it off for fun.
Actually, because she can't eat them.
So, and it was delicious. Anybody else have questions?
How do we ever get to know how we're doing in the class?
Sure. You just send me an email and I can tell you
Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
All right.
There's another way to get a more definitive measure. You wait until the end of the semester and then you look at your grades. All right. You guys are all you're doing what you need to do. So just make sure you read chapter 15. And I will see you on Wednesday then. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Yep.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Greenlaw.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sid, I take back everything I said bad about you.
When will we be getting our next assignment?
I don't know. The assignment will be using the DAD-DAS model, so it will depend on when we get done. Probably in about a week. Sid, you're back?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah.
I said, everything I said badly about you, I take back, because not only did you remind me to do the recording today, but you also reminded me that I had forgotten homework 6.
Yeah, I definitely didn't remind you to record after you said that you needed to record, but
Oh, really?
yeah,
You got
no
the
problem. I
points?
got your back. Yeah.
You got the points. So
I do have
you didn't answer one of my questions from earlier this morning, Sid. Just
I sent you a text, I thought, about the advice.
but you didn't answer all of my questions. But that's
Oh.
okay. Sorry,
All right.
Chester, you had a question?
Yeah, real quick. That class you mentioned that you're going to teach this coming semester.
Yes.
Do you know if that's going to count as like an elective for IA?
Okay, the short answer is no, I don't. It doesn't mean it can't, okay? And the reason why is because it's up to the IA program to decide that. So what I will do is send an email to Professor Kramer and see what he says. And then I'll let you know.
Okay.
All right? That would be awesome. But it does count towards an econ minor. Yeah, so, all right. Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
You said earlier, aggregate consumption accounts for
70%?
Well, it's like all the consumers. It's defined as all the consumers, like trying to maximize their utility. How else is it defined if that's?
Well, if you just think about all the aggregate demand side models we've been looking at, we said there's an aggregate consumption function. C equals A plus the MPC times Y, which is income. There's nothing about utility in there.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an attempt to bring what we teach in micro into how we think about macro, not just waving our hands and saying, well, sure, it works that way, but to actually build models that are based on the math that you learn in Econ 303.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how would you measure maximized utility then?
You don't measure the utility. Yeah. What you measure is the consumption, the aggregate consumption. that comes out of the utility maximizing process.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I think
In
Wait,
the same way,
could you-
in the same way that in a microeconomic content text, you can't measure people's utility, but what you can measure is what they buy. That we assume
okay.
is the result of maximizing their utility.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep.
So what was the question that I didn't answer?